So hello everyone and welcome to today's class. Today we are looking at data sources and the collection methods. And we shall start by observing that data may be broadly classified into two according to the source. And we have two sources of data, the primary and secondary sources. So from the primary source, we have the primary data, and from the secondary source, we have secondary data. So let's say that from primary sources, we have primary data. And then from secondary sources, we have secondary data. Okay. So we shall be looking at the data which is coming from each source, that is both primary data and secondary data. So let's start with the primary data and start by saying that this is data. This is data collected by the investigator. Self or herself for the purpose of a specific inquiry. For the purpose of a specific inquiry or study. And we can add that such data is original in character. Such data is original in character and is generated by individuals. It is generated by individuals or research institutions or organizations. So what I've written there in red is very key, is a distinctive feature of what we are calling primary data. This data is original in character. It is first-hand data which is being collected for the first time for the particular inquiry that is being solved by the researcher at the moment. Okay, so this data which has never been collected before, which is being collected for the first time and for a given inquiry. Let's have some illustration. So for instance, let's look at this illustration. You want to investigate the impact of school feeding programs in rural primary schools in Kenya. If that is your research topic, or maybe that's the problem that you want to solve. So for you to answer that research question, you need to undertake a survey. You need to conduct a survey, either a census survey or a sample survey, where you will collect data on the opinions of parents and of course any other stakeholders by asking relevant questions. When you say that the data obtained here is what we are calling primary data. The data obtained here is called primary data. It's called primary data because you are collecting it for the first time and for this particular inquiry. And you see that this can be done by individuals, or it can be done by organizations or even research institutions. Okay. So next, I want us to look at the methods of collecting primary data. And there are 5 methods that will be discussed in this class: the direct personal interviews, the indirect oral interviews, information from correspondence, mailed questionnaires, and finally, schedules sent through enumerators. So let's get started with direct personal interviews. direct personal interviews. So when you talk about the direct personal interviews, as we've mentioned, is a face-to-face meeting between the interviewer and the person being interviewed. If it's not direct, it means that either you're using a third party to access the information you are looking for from the person you are supposed to be interviewing. So let's start by saying that the persons from whom information is collected, the persons from whom information is collected are called in. So we're saying that the persons from whom the information is being collected are called informants. And then we say that in this method, the investigator meets the informants face to face. So these are face to face kind of interview where the researcher, the informant and the investigator meet directly or face to face. The one-on-one meeting. And we say that this method is suitable for intensive surveys. If you want to conduct a survey where you need so much details from the individual that you are interviewing, then this is the best method. But of course, the limitation is that you cannot apply this method when you have so many individuals to be interviewed, or if the individuals are spread all over a wide geographical area. So let's note that. So we're saying that this method is quite useful if you are conducting an interview or survey where you need so much details from the same individual. Okay, but it's quite limiting when you have individuals who are spread over a wide geographical area. So you find that it's limiting to in that perspective. So we can we can mention some of the merits of this method. What do you think are some of the merits of this method? Some of the advantages of this method? So some of the merits of the direct personal interviews is that non-response is minimized when you use this method. So non-response is a situation where some questions are returned unanswered because maybe the person who was supposed to answer did not understand the questions, or the respondent did not understand the questions, or they felt that the questions were too personal and they were not assured of the confidentiality of how the information will be treated. So you find that some questions will return unanswered. That's called non-response. But when you use this method, non-response is minimized. Number one, because these informants were personally approached, and so they also tend to supply the information willingly. Then you find that the information collected using this method is more uniform. You can unify the information and also make sure that it is accurate. It is more accurate compared to other methods. So if there are any questions that are not clear in the interview, you can always clarify them because you are getting, as some of you told me, you are getting immediate feedback. So if the question is not clear, you can always clarify. Or if you are not understanding some of the answers being given by the informant, you can always ask them to expound or to make them clear. Then the other advantage about this method is that you can get additional information or supplementary information about the respondents' personal aspects, okay? For instance, you can collect information about the character of the person and also the environment from where they stay, or maybe from where they are coming from and things like that. And those additional or supplementary information are quite useful when you come to the interpretation of some information after the analysis. So those are some of the merits. There are, of course, many other, so you can check them out. I want us to look at the limitations of this method, the limitations of this method. So some of the limitations of this method is that it is very costly and also time consuming, okay? Because every person is interviewed individually, then it takes quite some time for you to interview a single person. So if you have several people, it means that it is going to take a lot of time. And of course, time and money will move together. So it's time consuming and also it will be quite expensive. Then number two, we say that it is difficult when the respondents are spread over a wide geographical area. Because this has to be a face-to-face meeting, then you either have to travel to where the informant is, or the informant has to travel to where you are. And you have to pay for the travel costs, either through the bus or through a flight, and so on and so forth. Then finally, we have the issue of personal biases and prejudice because of the face-to-face meeting, simply because of the way the person speaks, maybe the way they talk, maybe where they live. You have your own personal biases, and these may prevent you from getting the information, the actual information that you are looking for. So those are some of the limitations of the direct personal interviews. Okay, so let's move to the next method of collecting primary data. So the next method of collecting primary data is the indirect oral interviews. And here, unlike in the first method where there is a face-to-face meeting between the interviewer and the informant, here the interviewer does not directly contact the informant, but the interviewer gets information from a third party, from a reliable third party, like a witness, a neighbor, a friend, or any other person who is capable of giving the correct information. So this kind of interview or indirect oral interview is preferred in cases where, in cases of murder or relating to murder, fire outbreaks, accidents, and drug addiction. This is because in all these cases, the person or the informant or the person who is supposed to be the informant, either they are not in a good state of mind. In some cases, they are injured or they have panicked. So they are not able or they are not in a position to give you reliable information. So you prefer to get the information from a third party. There's a serious challenge when this method is used in that depending on whom, on the person whom the evidence is being given, you might get some exaggerated information, or the information might be biased in a way. So for instance, if the information relates to a close relative, then you can be sure that the information may be biased in a way, okay? And so on and so forth. So those are some of the limitations of this method. So if you want to get valid information using this method, you need to interview several individuals who will give you or who will supply independent opinions about the matter being investigated. So that's a caution when you're using this method. I want us to have it, to write it down here. So we're saying that for the information collected here to be valid, several things needs to be put into consideration. Number one, you need to be careful about the nature of the person whose evidence is being collected. So that can bring some biases depending on who you are interviewing. Then as the interviewer, there are some skills that are important for you. Number one, you should be able to ask the right questions. For you to draw information from third parties, you need to be able to ask the right questions. And then from the information that you're going to collect, you need to cross-examine the information and get out the facts. You need to sieve out the facts from the information given by the independent respondents. And then you also need to interview several persons. You need to interview several people, then you can do the cross-examinations. So you need to be careful about that for you to get valid information. Now let's move to the third method of collecting primary data, and this is information from correspondence. That the information from correspondence, we're saying that correspondents are just agents who are coming from some localities or from some specific areas. So when we talk about correspondence, these are residents of a certain area who are appointed to collect information in those particular areas on behalf of the investigator. Okay, so this is a method that is used by media houses to collect information from different parts of the country, for instance, different counties. And it's also the same method that is used by government to collect information from the grassroots, okay? To collect information from the grassroots. In Kenya, when you have the general elections, the IEBC usually appoints some clerks or agents from different parts of the country or from different polling stations. And these individuals collect information on behalf of IEBC, and then they relay this information all the way to the head office for the analysis. So that's basically how this method works. So the fact that these people are agents who come from those localities might be a problem in a way. Okay, there might be some advantages in that these people know every corner of the areas that they are collecting the information. But the problem is sometimes the local agents might be giving biased reports. they might decide to give biased reports. If you remember, in Kenya, in the last general election, there were some issues that came out because some agents or some clerks decided not to sign some forms. So because of that, there was a lot of negligence, and the election results were nullified because of some negligence or some errors which could have been avoided. Okay, so those are some of the limitations that you might find when you use this method. So let's write them down. So we're saying that the advantage of this method is that it can cover a wide geographical area within a very short time, unlike the other methods. Okay, but there is a problem in that most of these correspondents are likely to be negligent, and others are prejudiced simply because you come from a certain area. You want the information to be reported in a certain way, be for your own benefits or for the benefit of your people, even if it means that you falsify some facts. So these are some of the limitations. And also biases are prevalent when this method is used. Okay, so when you're using that method, you need to be cautious about that. So let's move to the next method of collecting primary data, and that is using mailed questionnaires. So when we talk about the mailed questionnaires, we talk about a data collection method where the researcher or the investigator prepares a list of questions, and then this list of questions is delivered to the informant either through post office or through email, or you can deliver them by hand. And then once you deliver the list of questions, which is technically called a questionnaire, the informant completes them or writes down the responses in the absence of the respondent, of the interviewer. Then the questions are either posted back, so use the informant can use post office to send the questions back to the investigator, or can use email, or the investigator can pick them later. But the key thing here is that this list of questions is responded to by the informant in the absence of the investigator. That's what you call a questionnaire. If the list of questions is answered in the presence of both parties, that is the informant and the investigator, then we technically call that list a schedule. That list of questions is called a schedule, not a questionnaire. So let's add that in our notes. So we're saying that in addition to the list of questions, you must also have a letter of introduction or a covering letter, which will accompany the questionnaire. So this cover letter explains the purpose of your study and also requests the informants to give or to supply correct information. Of course, you have to assure them that all private information will be treated with confidentiality. And then you also ask them to return the questionnaire within a specified time. Maybe if they're sending through email or if they are posting back, or you can also inform them the time that you wish to come and pick the questionnaires for the analysis. Okay, so that's what you call the mailed questionnaires. Okay, so let's look at the merits and the demerits. And some of the merits, you notice that this method is fairly cheap compared to other methods, because look at, if for instance, if you decide to email the questionnaires to your respondents, or even to use post office, it is going to be quite cheap. It's going to be quite cheap. Maybe if you are talking about dropping them by hand, it might be quite expensive if the geographical area is wide. But if it's within the same area, even dropping them and picking them later would be quite cheap. Okay. Then this method is also okay if the informants are literate. If the informants are able to read and understand the questions on their own, then this method is perfect. But that can also come as a limitation, because if the informants are illiterate or they don't understand the language that we're using, then you find that this method is null and void. Okay, you cannot use this method when the informants are not literate or they don't understand the language that is used there. Okay, then another limitation is that some people decide not to respond to the questions, so non-response might be high in this method. Okay, but that can be reduced by writing a nice covering letter and also encouraging them to respond to your questions. But in this method, you notice that non-response is quite high. Some people decide not to respond, or they don't have time to fill in and then they post it back and things like that. So those are some of the merits and demerits of this method. Okay. So here are some of the limitations and merits and demerits. So we have said that it is fairly cheap, relatively cheap. And then it's also suitable when the respondents are spread over a wide geographical area. Okay. Then we also mentioned that the informants must be literate, should be able to read and write. Then some informants will choose not to fill in the form and return it. So that means there'll be high non-response when this method is used. Then the fact that the questions are answered or are responded to in the absence of the investigator, if there are questions which are not clear, or maybe the respondent feels that they are too personal, then chances are very high that you might get incorrect information being filled up there. So those are some of the limitations of this method. So you can't verify the correctness of the information supplied there. Okay. So any question there? So as mentioned, is that one of the reasons why you may not get correct or good information or quality information when you use this method is the nature of the questionnaire that you have. So, and your task is to state any 10 characteristics of a good questionnaire. 10 characteristics of a good questionnaire. Then let's move to another method, or the last method of collecting primary data, and that is what we are calling schedules sent through enumerators. So schedules sent through enumerators, and I mentioned that a schedule is just a list of questions, just like the one we were calling a questionnaire in the previous method. But the difference between a schedule and questionnaire is that a questionnaire, the questions are responded to by the respondent in the absence of the researcher in the absence of the researcher. Okay, and then they are posted back through either post office or email. But when you talk about a schedule here, the list of questions is presented or is carried by the enumerator or the interviewer, and then the enumerator is the one who writes down the answers. He writes down the answers given by the respondent. So unlike in the other case where the answers are written down by the respondent, here it is the interviewer who writes down the answers. The good thing with this method is that it is even suitable for respondents who are not literate or who cannot read and write, because you just need to read the question and possibly translate it into a language which the respondent can understand, and then you write down the answer in the official language. So this method is a very popular way. It's a very popular way of collecting data, though it is quite expensive because the enumerators must be thoroughly trained on how to conduct interviews, and even how, for instance, in the Kenyan context, we saw during the national census, the enumerators were supposed to send the data real time using some gadgets or using to apply some technology and relay the information real time to the Bureau of Statistics. Okay, so let's differentiate between a schedule and a questionnaire in a more formal way by saying the following. So this is a distinction between a schedule and a questionnaire, as we mentioned earlier, is that a schedule is filled by the enumerator in the presence of the informant. Then a questionnaire is a form that is filled by the respondent in the absence of the investigator, and it is transmitted through post office or email, or nowadays you can even use courier services and so on and so forth. So some of the merits and demerits of this method include that starting with the merits, we said that this method can be applied even for respondents who are illiterate, because you just need someone who can read and interpret the questions, and then you get the responses. Then you also find that non-response is minimized because these are face-to-face meeting. So chances are very high that the respondent is willing to supply the information which is being required. Then the information collected using this method is usually very reliable, very reliable method information, because the enumerators or the interviewers are usually very well trained. Okay, and some of the demerits is that this method is the most expensive method, quite expensive. Then you also need to do thorough training of the enumerators, which is part of what makes it very expensive. Then the last demerit is a soft skill that is required, and that is interviewing. For you to get information through interviews, you need skill, you need interviewing skills, and you also need experience. When you lack that, then you find that the information collected might be less reliable. So those are some of the merits and demerits of that method. So I want to give you some task here. And the task is explain any four, so task, explain any four merits and demerits of primary data. Explain any four merits and demerits of primary data. So primary data is the data that is collected using the methods that we've discussed out there. What are some of the merits and demerits of such data? Okay. So when you look at secondary data, let's look at secondary data. So we say that this is data which has been previously collected by and even analyzed, and even possibly even the results have been published by some earlier agency or individuals or organizations. But later on, some other individual or agency comes and uses the same data to answer a different research question or a related research question. So that data, which was initially collected, analyzed, and presented by some other agency, and now is being used by another individual, is what we're calling secondary data. Okay, so if a company is collecting data on a regular basis and they are putting that data in their website, to that company, that is primary data. But if somebody comes later and uses that data for a certain research project, then to the second person, then that is secondary data. Okay, so unlike the primary data, which we said is original in character, secondary data is not original in character. It is data that has been used already, has been summarized possibly, and so on and so forth. Okay. So in order to see a good distinction between secondary data and primary data, we are going to quote this person called W.A. Neiswenger, who said that a primary source is a publication in which the data are published by the same authority. Here, authority means an individual, organization, institution, and so on and so forth, which gathered and analyzed them. Then he also went ahead and said that a secondary source is a publication reporting the data which have been gathered by other authorities and for which others are responsible. So that's a clear distinction between what we're calling primary data and secondary data. Okay. Then before we finish, I want us to say that there are two sources of secondary data. That's what we call the published sources and unpublished sources. So let's have that one. So we're saying that broadly speaking, there are two sources of secondary data. So that is published sources and unpublished sources. So in short, we're saying that secondary data may come from either a published source or an unpublished source. When we talk about a published source, these are sources, for instance, something like a book. Like a book is an official publication, something like an official website of a company, of a government agency, and so on and so forth. Those are published sources. But you'll notice that there is a lot of information which is kept by companies or individuals which has not been published. Okay, maybe like an unpublished research work, or maybe the information collected by most of the departments of inquiry. They keep so much information, possibly about the customers who visit there, but that information is not put in the company website or is not put in the computer systems, but it's somewhere in some files. So someone may want to use that information to do some investigation or to conduct some research. So those are examples of what we are calling unpublished sources of secondary data. So I want us to stop there for today. I'll ask you to get examples in each of the cases here. you get examples of published sources of data and also unpublished sources of data. And that will mark the end of today's class. So let's meet next week.